My name is David Matthews. I'm 38 years old, and I live in Cedar Falls, a small town in Ohio where everyone knows everyone's business, except for one secret that's haunted our community for over 2 decades. When I was 15, our beloved Reverend Samuel Brown vanished without a trace on a cold October night in 1999. The church elders said he'd been called to minister elsewhere, but he never said goodbye to anyone, not even to me, the boy he'd been mentoring since my father's death. For 23 years, I carried the weight of unanswered questions and abandoned faith. I stopped going to church, stopped believing in divine justice, stopped believing in much of anything at all. But last Tuesday, I received a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about that terrible night and about the man who shaped my childhood faith. What I discovered in the next 7 days didn't just solve the mystery of Reverend Brown's disappearance, it restored my faith in God, in justice, and in the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. Tell me, in the comments, would you keep searching for answers to a mystery that destroyed your faith? The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting me awake in my cramped apartment above Miller's hardware store. The voice on the other end was shaky. Elderly, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, the church secretary who'd been there since before I was born. David, honey, I know we haven't spoken since you stopped coming around, but I need to tell you something before it's too late, about Reverend Brown. My blood ran cold. 23 years had passed since anyone in Cedar Falls had dared speak Samuel Brown's name aloud. The official story was that he'd accepted a calling to mission work in South America, but everyone knew something was wrong. Good reverends don't abandon their flock in the middle of the night, leaving behind their reading glasses on the pulpit and their favorite coffee mug still warm in the church kitchen. Mrs. Hutchins, I don't think I'm dying, David. Pancreatic cancer, and I can't take this secret to my grave. Her voice cracked. Meet me at the church tonight, midnight. Come alone and bring a shovel. The line went dead. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the phone. The last time I'd set foot in Cedar Falls Community Church was for my mother's funeral 8 years ago. I'd sat in the back pew, numb with grief, while Pastor Williams, Brown's replacement, delivered a sermon about God's mysterious ways. I'd walked out before the final hymn and never looked back. But Mrs. Hutchins's words echoed in my mind all day. Bring a shovel. What had she buried? What had she hidden all these years? As darkness fell over Cedar Falls, I found myself driving the familiar streets of my childhood, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The church sat on Maple Street, its white steeple piercing the October sky like an accusing finger. Mrs. Hutchins was waiting in the shadow of the oak tree where Reverend Brown used to hold Bible study on summer evenings. She looked frail in the moonlight, her once proud shoulders bent with age and secrets. In her gnarled hand, she clutched an old wooden box, the kind used for church offerings decades ago. I've carried this burden for 23 years, she whispered, pressing the box into my hands. Samuel gave this to me the night before that terrible night. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should give it to someone who really knew his heart. You were like a son to him, David. My fingers traced the worn wood. Mrs. Hutchins, what really happened to him? Her eyes filled with tears. Open the box, child. Then meet me at Miller's Creek tomorrow at dawn, near the old baptismal site. And David, she gripped my arm with surprising strength. Trust no one else, not Pastor Williams, not the deacons, not even Sheriff Morrison. The truth has been buried too long. She disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the box and more questions than ever. But that was just the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. The wooden box sat on my kitchen table like a time bomb, demanding to be opened, yet terrifying me with its possibilities. As the first gray light of dawn crept through my windows, I finally found the courage to lift the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded purple cloth, the color of the Lenten season, was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Reverend Brown's handwriting filled every line, documenting his final months with meticulous detail. But it was the loose letter tucked between the pages that made my heart stop. If you're reading this, then they've silenced me as they tried to silence the others. David, my boy, you must finish what I started. The truth lies beneath the old oak, not the one by the church, but the one where we buried your father's ashes. Look for the stone marked with a cross and the date, 10/31/99. God forgive me for what I've discovered. God forgive me for what I must do. October 31st, 1999, the night he disappeared. My father's burial site was a small clearing by Miller's Creek, where Reverend Brown had performed private ceremonies for families who couldn't afford the cemetery fees. I'd helped him dig that shallow grave when I was 14, my tears mixing with the October rain as we laid my father's ashes to rest beneath the ancient oak. Mrs. Hutchins was already there when I arrived, her small frame dwarfed by the massive tree. Without a word, I began digging where she pointed, a spot marked by a crude stone cross, now nearly buried by decades of fallen leaves. 3 feet down, my shovel struck metal. "Dear God," Mrs. Hutchins whispered, as I unearthed a rusted lockbox. He really did it. Samuel really buried the evidence. Inside the box, protected by plastic bags, were documents that made my hands shake. Bank statements showing large cash deposits to several church accounts, copies of falsified building permits, and photographs, dozens of them, showing what appeared to be illegal dumping of industrial waste on church-owned land. But it was the final item that nearly brought me to my knees. A cassette tape labeled Insurance Policy SB. Mrs. Hutchins produced an old portable player from her purse. I kept this after Samuel's disappearance, thinking maybe someday. We listened in horrified silence as Reverend Brown's voice filled the morning air. October 30th, 1999. This is Samuel Brown. If something happens to me, I want the truth on record. For 3 months, I've been documenting Pastor Williams and Deacon Morrison's scheme to embezzle church funds and illegally dump toxic waste from Morrison's chemical plant on consecrated ground. Tonight, I'm confronting them with this evidence. They've been using our church, God's house, as a front for their crimes, and I won't stand silent any longer. The tape continued, detailing meetings, bribes, and threats. Reverend Brown had discovered that the new church expansion fund was actually being used to clean up illegal waste disposal, with the church property serving as a dumping ground. Pastor Williams, who'd been an associate pastor at the time, was in on it from the beginning. "They killed him," I whispered, the awful truth settling over me like a shroud. "They killed him to keep him quiet." Mrs. Hutchins nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. I suspected, but I could never prove it. I was too scared to come forward. They're powerful men, David. They own half this town. What I found next left me breathless. Walking into Cedar Falls Community Church for the first time in 8 years felt like entering a tomb. The Sunday morning service was in full swing, Pastor Williams's booming voice echoing off the stained glass windows as he preached about the rewards of faithful stewardship. The irony wasn't lost on me. I slipped into the back pew, the same spot I'd occupied as a rebellious teenager, and studied the man who'd taken Reverend Brown's place. Pastor Williams had aged well, too well for a small-town preacher. His expensive suit, gold watch, and polished shoes spoke of prosperity that should have been impossible on a modest church salary. After the service, I approached him during the fellowship hour, my heart pounding with nervous energy. "Pastor Williams, I'm David Matthews. I used to attend here when Reverend Brown—" "Of course, little David." His smile was wide but didn't reach his eyes. "I remember you well. Such a tragedy about your loss of faith after Samuel's departure. But the Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" "That's what I wanted to ask you about," I pressed. "Reverend Brown's departure. It was so sudden." Something flickered across Williams's face. Fear? Anger? "Oh, that was a long time ago, son. Samuel felt called to mission work, South America, I believe. We haven't heard from him since, but I'm sure he's doing God's work somewhere. Funny thing, I said, watching his reaction carefully. I've been trying to track down missionaries named Samuel Brown, and I can't find any record of him anywhere in South America, or anywhere else, for that matter. Pastor Williams's smile faltered. Well, mission work can be fluid, remote areas, you understand. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have appointments to keep. He hurried away, but not before I caught him exchanging meaningful glances with Sheriff Morrison, who'd been lingering near the coffee table. Morrison approached me with the swagger of a man used to intimidating others. David Matthews. Heard you were asking questions about ancient history. Just curious about an old friend. Curiosity killed the cat, son. Some things are better left buried. His hand rested meaningfully on his service weapon. This is a peaceful town. We like to keep it that way. The threat was clear, but I'd come too far to back down now. That afternoon, I visited the town records office, hoping to find more evidence of the illegal activities Reverend Brown had documented. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I'd expected. The land records showed that 3 parcels of church property had been quietly sold to Morrison Industries in late 1999, just weeks after Brown's disappearance. The sale prices were suspiciously low, and the environmental impact studies that should have been required for industrial use were nowhere to be found. But when I requested copies of the original deeds, the clerk, a nervous young woman named Sarah, glanced around nervously before whispering, "Those files were sealed by court order, sheriff's orders." When, right after that preacher disappeared, Sheriff Morrison said it was for everyone's safety. I couldn't believe what I saw through the window. That night, I sat in my apartment studying Reverend Brown's journal by lamplight, searching for clues I might have missed. His entries from September and October 1999 painted a picture of a man wrestling with his conscience, torn between his duty to his congregation and his moral obligation to expose corruption. September 15th. Confirmed my suspicions about the building fund. William showed me the books today, and the numbers don't add up. We're supposedly raising money for a new fellowship hall, but I've seen Morrison's trucks dumping barrels behind the church at night. The smell alone makes my eyes water. September 28th. Confronted Williams about the discrepancies. He got angry, said I was imagining things, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He knows I know. October 15th. Found Morrison's environmental impact reports in Williams' office. The chemical waste they're dumping could poison the groundwater for decades. This isn't just theft, it's environmental terrorism. How can I stand in the pulpit knowing what's happening on consecrated ground? October 25th. They offered me money to keep quiet. Williams said I could take a sabbatical with full pay if I'd just stop asking questions. When I refused, Morrison made it clear what would happen to troublemakers in his town. The final entry was dated October 30th, 1999. The night before his disappearance, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about Jesus cleansing the temple, driving out the money changers with righteous fury. Tomorrow, I'm calling the EPA and the State Attorney General. Let God's will be done, whatever the cost. If something happens to me, I pray someone will continue the fight for justice. The truth must not die with me. I was so absorbed in reading that I almost missed the soft knock at my door. It was past midnight. Who would be visiting at this hour? Through the peephole, I saw a small figure in a hooded jacket. When I opened the door, a young woman stepped into the light, Sarah from the records office, her face pale with fear. "Mr. Matthews, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I couldn't wait until morning. After you left today, Sheriff Morrison came to the office asking what you'd been looking for. When I told him, he got really angry and told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd lose my job." She pulled a manila envelope from under her jacket. "But before he sealed those files years ago, I made copies. My mother was friends with Mrs. Brown, Reverend Brown's wife. She died of grief 2 years after he disappeared, still believing he'd abandoned her. My mom always said something wasn't right about the whole thing. The envelope contained photocopies of the original environmental assessments for the church property, dated before Morrison's chemical plant was built. The land had been pristine then, perfect soil composition for agriculture, clean groundwater, no contamination. But there were also newer documents, dated after Brown's disappearance, showing massive chemical contamination that would require expensive cleanup. "Look at the dates," Sarah whispered. "The contamination reports are all from after November 1999. And look at this." She showed me a medical examiner's report I'd never seen before, a preliminary autopsy on an unidentified male found in Miller's Creek in December 1999. The body had been badly decomposed, but the height, age, and dental work were consistent with Samuel Brown. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the skull. "Why wasn't this ever followed up?" I asked. "Because Sheriff Morrison ruled it a suicide. Said the man must have fallen from the old railroad bridge. But look at this." She pointed to a handwritten note in the margin. "Victim's hands showed defensive wounds, inconsistent with suicide theory. Recommend further investigation." The note was signed by Deputy Frank Reynolds, a name I recognized. He'd been Morrison's partner until he was killed in a suspicious car accident in early 2000. He dropped the bag, and what was inside changed everything, armed with Sarah's evidence, and, driven by 23 years of suppressed grief and anger, I knew it was time to force the truth into the light. But I also knew I couldn't face Morrison and Williams alone. They'd already killed twice to protect their secret, and I had no doubt they'd kill again. I called Mrs. Hutchins and asked her to meet me at the church that evening. "Bring whatever other evidence you've been hiding," I told her. "Tonight, we end this." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky the color of old blood, I parked behind the church and made my way to the cemetery. Mrs. Hutchins was waiting by Reverend Brown's memorial stone, a modest marker erected by his widow, who'd never stopped believing he'd come home someday. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice stronger than I'd heard it. "About finishing what Samuel started. I may be dying, but I can still fight for justice." She handed me another cassette tape. "I recorded this 2 days after Samuel disappeared. I was scared they'd come for me next, so I hid it in my hope chest and never touched it again." We listened as her younger voice filled the night air. "November 2nd, 1999. This is Eleanor Hutchins. I need to record what I saw the night Reverend Brown disappeared. I was at the church late, preparing the altar for All Saints' Day, when I heard shouting from the pastor's office. I recognized Samuel's voice and Pastor Williams. But there was another man too, Sheriff Morrison. They were arguing about money and chemicals and keeping quiet. Then I heard a terrible crash, like furniture being overturned. I hid in the supply closet, but I saw them carrying something heavy out the back door wrapped in a tarp. They put it in Morrison's truck and drove toward Miller's Creek. When I came out of hiding, there was blood on the office floor." "My God," I whispered, "you witnessed the murder." "I was too scared to come forward," she said, tears flowing freely. "Morrison was the law in this town. Who would have believed me? And Samuel was already gone. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, they'd leave me alone." A twig snapped behind us, and we both spun around. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the shadows, his gun drawn, his face twisted with rage and desperation. 23 years, he snarled. 23 years of peace, and you two just couldn't leave well enough alone." "It's over, Morrison," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We have evidence of everything. The embezzlement, the illegal dumping, the murder. It's already been sent to the state attorney general." He laughed bitterly. "You think anyone's going to believe a bitter ex-believer and a senile old woman? I've been the law in this town for 30 years. My word against yours. What about Deputy Reynolds?" Mrs. Hutchins asked suddenly. "He knew the truth too, didn't he? That's why you killed him." Morrison's face went white. Frank was getting too curious, just like his bleeding heart Reverend friend. Some people don't know when to mind their own business. Pastor Williams appeared from behind a monument, looking sick with fear. "This is insane, Morrison. We should have stopped after Samuel. Now look what's happening." "Shut up," Morrison snapped. "You're as deep in this as I am. Your precious church has been funded by dirty money for decades." "I never wanted anyone to die," Williams protested. "I just wanted to expand the ministry." "With blood money," I said, my anger finally boiling over. "You desecrated everything Reverend Brown believed in. You turned God's house into a crime scene." Morrison raised his gun. "Enough talk. You're both going to have tragic accidents, just like Frank Reynolds." But before he could fire, headlights flooded the cemetery. State police cars surrounded us, officers emerging with weapons drawn. Sarah stepped out of the lead car, followed by a woman in an FBI jacket. "Sheriff Morrison, you're under arrest for the murders of Samuel Brown and Frank Reynolds, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, and embezzlement of federal funds." Morrison's gun wavered. "How did you—" "Sarah contacted the FBI 3 days ago," the agent explained. "We've been building a case based on the evidence you provided, Mr. Matthews. We've also exhumed the body from Miller's Creek. DNA confirms it was Reverend Brown." Morrison's face crumpled with defeat. Pastor Williams fell to his knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," he kept repeating. "I'm so sorry. Will they find all the truth? Will evidence be enough?" The trials that followed were the biggest news Cedar Falls had seen in decades. Morrison and Williams were both convicted on multiple charges. Morrison for first-degree murder, conspiracy, and environmental crimes. Williams for conspiracy, embezzlement, and accessory after the fact. The FBI's investigation revealed the full scope of their crimes. Morrison's chemical plant had been illegally dumping toxic waste on the church property for over 20 years, contaminating the groundwater and soil. The church's building fund had been used to cover up the environmental damage, while Morrison pocketed EPA cleanup money. When Reverend Brown discovered the scheme and threatened to expose it, Morrison killed him in the church office during what was supposed to be a final negotiation. They buried his body near Miller's Creek, then spread the story about his sudden departure for mission work. Deputy Reynolds had grown suspicious when the suicide body was found so close to where witnesses had seen Morrison's truck that night. His accident was actually Morrison running him off the road when Reynolds threatened to reopen the case. Mrs. Hutchins testified at both trials, her voice strong and clear as she recounted what she'd witnessed that terrible night. The jury was visibly moved when she spoke about living with the secret for over 2 decades and how the guilt had nearly killed her. "I failed Samuel Brown in life," she said from the witness stand, "but I won't fail him in death. Justice delayed is not justice denied." The financial investigation revealed that Morrison had stolen over $2 million in EPA funds intended for environmental cleanup, while Williams had embezzled nearly $500,000 from church accounts. The toxic contamination would require a multi-million-dollar cleanup that would take years to complete. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Morrison himself. During interrogation, overwhelmed by guilt and facing life in prison, he broke down and confessed everything. "I never meant for it to go so far," he sobbed to investigators. "It started small, just a few barrels of waste I couldn't afford to dispose of properly. Samuel caught wind of it and wanted to shut down this whole operation. He said he'd rather see the church close than be built on poisoned ground." "So you killed him?" "It was an accident at first. We were arguing and he wouldn't listen to reason. I pushed him and he hit his head on the desk. But then William started panicking, saying we'd both go to prison. So we made it look like he'd left town. The confession was recorded and played at trial," Morrison's broken voice filling the courtroom as he described disposing of Reverend Brown's body and then killing Deputy Reynolds when he got too close to the truth. When the verdicts came down, life in prison for Morrison, 25 years for Williams, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the good men who died fighting for truth. And just when I thought it was over, God showed me the truth. 6 months after the trials ended, I found myself standing in the renovated sanctuary of Cedar Falls Community Church. The toxic waste had been cleaned up, the building had been restored, and a new pastor, Reverend Sarah Martinez, had been called to lead the congregation. The church had established the Samuel Brown Memorial Fund for Environmental Justice, using the recovered embezzled money to help other communities fight toxic contamination. Mrs. Hutchins, her cancer now in remission after successful treatment, served as the fund's first director. "It's what Samuel would have wanted," she told me, as we stood before the new memorial window dedicated to his memory. The stained glass depicted Jesus cleansing the temple with words beneath, "The truth shall set you free." I'd been attending services regularly for 3 months now, something that would have seemed impossible a year ago. The faith I'd lost as a teenager had returned gradually, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It wasn't the simple, uncomplicated faith of my youth. It was deeper, tempered by loss and strengthened by justice. "I used to blame God for taking Reverend Brown away from me," I told Pastor Martinez after Sunday service. "I thought he'd abandoned us all." "Maybe God was waiting for you to be ready to hear his voice again," she suggested gently. "Sometimes he works through imperfect people to accomplish perfect justice." I thought about that as I walked to the cemetery, carrying a bouquet of white lilies, Reverend Brown's favorite flowers. His body had been properly buried beside his wife, their shared headstone engraved with the words he lived by. "Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." Standing at his grave, I finally found the words I'd been searching for 23 years. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find the truth," I whispered. "I'm sorry I lost faith when you needed me to be strong, but I kept my promise. I finished what you started." A gentle breeze rustled the oak leaves above his grave, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice again, telling me what he'd always told the troubled teenagers. He counseled, "God never gives up on us, David, even when we give up on him." I'd recently been accepted into seminary at 38. I was starting the journey to become the minister Reverend Brown had always believed I could be. It felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness as I walked. Back toward town, the church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayer. For the first time in over 2 decades, I quickened my pace, eager to answer the call. Maybe God never left. Maybe he was waiting for me to look again.